as I'm about to turn 47 years young, it is quite cathartic to be able to continue to reach deep inside the world of rhythm and pull out cats who have been trying to create seminal original rhythm for quite some time. One of the things that has sort of been a little bit deflating for me is just the fact that my daughters and younger generations have had digital beats crunched into their ears for decades and really don't really know, um, the idea or the healing power of human rhythm. And
Hmm.
my guest has been healing cats on the bandstand with so many iconic acts, but in a lot of ways, in his own right, always changing up the beat, changing up the groove, and throwing people off, keeping people off balance, and really creating vocabulary, new vocabulary on the bandstand. Still doing it today. Bill Bruford, welcome to the Jake Feinberg Show.
Jay, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's an honor, my brother. I just wanted you to talk about your concept because this is very important to me. I mean, a lot of bands that sort of came to the forefront in the late 60s, one of the goals was to collectively lose the downbeat or lose where the one is. And some of them, some of the drummers I've interviewed, they talk about the fact that any note can be the one. And the idea is that once the trust builds up amongst the comrades on the bandstand, when you lose the collective one and you go out and come back in, it's one of the most cathartic feelings in the world. And I kind of just wanted you to talk about your concept of the idea that any note can be the one.
Well, yeah, I suppose drumming's all about stress and accent, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, conventionally we have four beats to the bar in the West. In England, it's a godforsaken sort of dull, dumb thud, boosh, 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 which is what the average Englishman, I think, a determinedly arrhythmic nation. Um,
I love this, dude. Oh my God, I love that line. All right, go ahead.
we kind of imported American US notions of rhythm, I think, and so
Mhm.
inherited a backbeat, thing called a backbeat, which we didn't really talk about much until I was about 16, 17 years old. We didn't really know what a backbeat was. But I grew up listening to African American music, of course, and absolutely adored it and gravitated towards that. Um, and displacing the beats. The jazz drummers that I grew up with, Elvin and Max Roach and Art Blakey and so forth, they were past masters at this and making little bits of architecture with their drum solos. And I fell for all that. It seemed perfectly straightforward to me, although not so to the British rhythmic listening or rock audience who thought I was doing something very fresh and new. I think perhaps I was importing things from American jazz into British rock, perhaps, more or less by mistake. I grew up with jazz, so I fell into rock by accident. I kind of thought that my first band, Yes, was going to be a jazz group. I mean, I didn't really know it was going to be a rock group until we'd done a couple of gigs. And then I was happy with that, happy to be working. So I'm pretty open with where the beat is in the measure, and I like guys who like to work with guys who are confident in that area too.
Can you talk about this displacement of the beat? I mean, Elvin, like, I mean, I never grew up during this time, but it's this idea of um, it's about where the pulse is. It's about playing through the time. And I see so many cats who maybe it's just about self-confidence or security, but they're very consumed about where the downbeat is and sort of, not going on a limb too far. And yet here you are just pushing the envelope. I mean, were there outside of the BBC jazz that you were saturated in, were there any cats on the bandstand locally that you were getting off on um that were playing through time, for lack of a better word?
No, there weren't many drummers around in 65, 66, 67 in the UK. who weren't jazz drummers. Most of them were jazz drummers, and they were the best studio guys because they could read a bit of music.
Right.
And, and guys who also fell into rock. People like Mitch Mitchell, for example, came out of Elvin, and he ended up with Hendrix. And
Absolutely.
I suppose he would be one of the first guys I thought, that's nice and fluid around that downbeat. We don't have to have that heavy one coming in many times, in my opinion, lots of times. And had this feeling of nailing the rhythm to the floor. So it couldn't go anywhere, which I think is probably what the producer, the record company, the listener wanted, although they didn't really know they wanted that. And you and I know that there are other
I
ways of
love, dude, you were there. Okay, so this is really important. You said something fascinating about Yes, where at first you thought you might be a jazz group until the first couple of gigs. But I remember Johnny Densmore from the Doors,
Mhm.
when he was on Elektra, Jack Holtzman's label, the Doors, he said, um, the bean counters left us alone. The lawyers left us alone at that time because we were making them money, and they said, "Hey, we don't really know what these musicians are doing, but we're just going to let them do it because we're all get better off for it." And then eventually, like you talked about, this sort of uh, you know nailing to the floor, this incessant backbeat that got louder and louder in the 70s, and a lot of adherence to pop music and sort of play straight beats, don't play yourself. It got very formulaic. And I just wanted you to talk about you personally, but also the band. Yes, like how much creative control did you have of your music at that time? And what I mean by that is the ability to create new musical vocabulary in a pretty straight rock world at that time.
Well, tons of freedom, mostly thanks to the Beatles. The Beatles changed everything. Right after the Beatles, the record companies were awash with money. They had no idea really quite what to do with it. So basically 2 or 3 albums, a couple of years, and we were down. We were getting rude letters from the record company after about album number two had not been a success, and we'd made no impression in the United States at all by that point, and we were down to kind of our last $50. But we proceeded by hook or by crook, and I don't quite know how, under the leadership really of John Anderson, the singer, who was determined to make a small 4 or 5 piece group sound like an orchestra in some way. Um, and in those days, kind of prurience, as somebody's put it, of computers, the drummer, I was kind of like the conductor with a pair of sticks.
I love this.
If the passage of music felt it needed to lean forward into the beat, that was fine by me. And, it needed to move ahead in tempo to join the incoming section, and that's fine too. Or the reverse would happen. So we weren't nailed to the floor in that sense. In fact, on Monday night, I might think the slow section should be faster, and on Tuesday night, the slow section should be slower, and so forth. We were different. The rhythms were different every night. Tempi were different. And come the 1970s, I kind
You wanted to sing for your supper and not starve to death. I mean, it was
of
like,
was something like that.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, by that point, if you were doing anywhere near a recording studio, it all had to be measured and quantized and the rest of it. But my sense of time came from a pre-digital and a pre-computer area in which time was a much more fluid thing, as indeed is in jazz.
Can you talk about your and strive for excellence?
Hmm.
And
Good for
was the
you.
what? Yeah, thank you. And was the modicum of success, or the reason the band didn't really hit it, was because there wasn't any radio friendly tracks for the first two albums? What was the, because to
Oh yeah.
me, I mean, and also like, can you talk about your sort of orchestral conduct?
It gets kind of forgotten somehow in the wash, but like many bands, we started by covering other people's music. One of which was Stephen Still's song, I think, from the Byrds, I think probably called I See You.
It was a David Crosby, maybe.
David Crosby, maybe.
Yeah, Crosby. Yeah, yeah.
That's right. And I'm not going to be too specific about stuff recorded about 50 years ago.
It's
But
okay.
in general, there's no click track, of course, running in the headphones, and you'll hear the tempo move up as Banks and I take this kind of duet. And I find that exciting. It didn't bother me at all. And lots of the jazz records I'd heard as a kid, move forward in excitement and back again, maybe for a big statement at the end. And all this was
Absolutely.
fine. We didn't know that that would be a problem, which it later became, of course, as music became more commercialized. But certainly, nobody quite knew what to do with the beginnings of quite knew what was going on, and rules were being broken all over the place and left in little bits on the floor. And we reserved the right to make up our music from any source we felt was the right thing to do. And John Anderson had symphonic ears. He liked a big sound. He sat in front of the TV all day, so half the stuff sounded like the big country theme or Bonanza or some cop show. Stuff was picked up from anywhere and everywhere to make our kind of so-called progressive rock. Um, and then pretty soon we found we could write our own bits of music, and then we could expand and join those together, and then we were often flying. But that wasn't until 3 albums, really. So we
Right. And I
started,
mean that's kind
yeah,
of the, I mean, if you look at Joni Mitchell or Bruce Springsteen or James Taylor, like those cats didn't have any radio friendly hits for their first two or three albums either. But yet there was
yeah.
this the record company stuck with you though, you know?
Yes, just about. They weren't financing the band quite. I suppose you'd say they stuck with us in the sense that they picked up the album tab. I think that's great, and they may have taken a one-page advertisement in some small magazine, but this wasn't big bucks, and they had big bucks for sure. So we were just a little fruit growing on the tree,
I love
which
this.
which could be plucked eventually when it had ripened, but it hadn't ripened yet. That kind of thing. Um, but we were lucky, I mean, people like me are eternally grateful somehow that I started out as a musician in this sunlit place where you could play anything at any time with pretty much anyone. You could do 2 or 3 shows a week and pay for an apartment in London and live, on that and look for a better gig for the other 4 days of the week, which was the kind of thing we were doing. And it was all relatively easy. We didn't know any better. We didn't know anything else, of course.
I'm curious, when I interviewed the late great John Mayall, he talked about
Oh yeah.
and that you're talking about this, you really articulated it beautifully about this, sort of, I don't know. I mean, the Beatles were like original rock group. Then it goes to blues rock. Then it goes to psychedelic rock, and
Hmm.
jazz is completely a popular music throughout that decade. Um, but Mayall talked about like there was no color bar in Europe. Sure, there's racism, but it wasn't like in the United States. Because I was obsessed with his albums with Blue Mitchell and Red Holiday, and and
Hmm.
he said he goes when those guys came over, it wasn't they were respected for their genius. And I just am curious about. I remember I interviewed Rick Laird, the late great bass player. He was the house bass player at Ronnie Scott's, and Sonny Rollins would come in for 6 nights. And
Yeah.
were you able outside of the BBC because you were playing brushes on the record covers, and I mean this is so
Yeah.
classic. But did you get a chance to see Art Taylor or Train or
Yeah, no,
Elvis?
not quite that far back. I mean, I remember as an 18-year-old hearing Roy Haynes and Gary Burton up in Leeds, which was great,
Oh
maybe
my God.
seven, 17 perhaps. And
Oh,
that
was
was
that
the
with
first,
Stan Getz or was who was the leader in that?
Gary Burton.
Barrett, yeah, okay.
And, that was the first time I heard snap, crackle, and pop, how they used to describe Roy's snare drum playing. And the first time it would have occurred to me that you could sound different from the other guy, and that would be a nice thing to be able to do. These kind of very elementary ideas were fermenting fast in my brain as I heard quite a lot of music. I heard at Ronnie Scott's, you could hear you could hear Roland Kirk and Jimi Hendrix play a set, which was nice. But nobody, color, racial issues didn't really come into any of this at all. We were just thrilled to have great American stars over. They could be white, green, or black. It didn't matter at all.
Absolutely. No, you're telling me that because I know there was an upstairs and a downstairs. You're telling me Kirk and Hendrix on the bandstand together?
Yeah,
Oh
yeah.
my God, dude. I mean, I
Well,
lose my mind, dude.
yeah, that was fun. That was yeah, that was a great deal of fun. And so there were great nights, but we'd also hear Buddy Rich. We'd also hear a lot of other people. It was fantastic. I never heard Train. I know that was before a bit before my time. But funnily enough, what was very particularly bad here, really, well, it may have been the same in the States, was kind of the genre specificity that you could be a rock player and you could like you could like Jimi Hendrix, you could be a jazz player and you could like Coltrane, but you couldn't like them both. You see
That
what I
is
mean?
so. You're telling me at that time it was so stratified. You really needed to stay in your
Very,
lane.
very stratified. A rock guy trying to play jazz was
Wow.
laughable.
Wow.
And a jazz guy trying to play rock was even worse. And both would be accused of selling out of their particular genre. So the jazz guy, any jazz guy slipping into Jimi Hendrix experience would lose any jazz credibility right away. It was all that kind of absolute nonsense there. So the nonsense in the UK scene was not racial, it was generic.
Would you say that unfortunately that came primarily from people like myself, people that were writing about the music and they needed to brand the music? I mean, I don't think the musicians were, I mean, maybe they could critique your style, but most musicians I know, I mean, I don't know, Stan Getz when Huey Lewis's dad was a huge big band fan, and
Uh-huh.
when in San Francisco, Stan first met Huey in the early 80s, and he's like, I can play your rock shit too. I mean, the musicians didn't seem pretty open-minded. The
Yeah,
stratification, yeah.
yeah, increasingly these days too. The young
I mean, it's
musicians,
worse than ever now?
worse than ever or better than ever?
Well, I feel like there's a need younger generations, not that I think the musicians can are so um, well versed that they can float in, through genres. But
Yes,
I just say that
yes.
there's the branding is worse than ever now. Like it's
Oh,
just,
indeed. Okay. All
you know what
right.
I'm
Yes.
saying? Yeah.
The,
Like
the
especially
branding is worse than ever.
at the especially at the academy level, where before Charlie Mariano would get off the road, maybe try to kick a drug habit, pick up a new instrument, and then get back on the touring circuit. Now it's
Hmm.
like they're trying to figure out how you can brand yourself to make it in the music racket. It's just
Yeah.
it's sort of
Yeah.
so you never. But I want to be clear about Brother Bruford. Outside of maybe a couple of lessons from, but you were never part of the ivory tower.
No, no, not until recently when I studied and got a doctorate in musicology, funnily
Right.
enough, recently. But no, at the beginning, I just picked up a pair of sticks and got going myself. And there was no YouTube, of course, and very hard to figure out how people played things. So we slowed the album down by putting coins on the groove thing, so that you could hear Tony Williams go fla da da fla da da fla da 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 fla da da. And you would try and transcribe that, and you try and play what Tony was doing, which of course didn't really work out, and it didn't sound like Tony. But then you'd say to yourself, "Well, shit, I don't sound like Tony." But that thing there sounded really good, so I'm going to follow that bit. You see what I mean? We weren't very
I
good at
completely love that's the same. You're just finding your own. You're finding your own self.
finding my own stuff. I
Yeah.
failed. I failed at trying to copy Tony. I failed at trying to copy everybody, which is great. So I ended up with bits of everybody, and you try to mold that into something that sounds vaguely Bruford. And people always say, "Oh, well, I recognize you from your snare drum sound." Actually, tell you the truth, I played a million snare drums, so the snare drum is not actually the thing. What they really mean is, if they're a bit more musical, that kind of person would say what they're recognizing is a beat displacement. Somehow my backbeat has gone forward a note or back a note, or is not where it should be. That's usually what people hear when they hear me.
Absolutely profound. I mean, I was going to ask you about this too, because Reggie Workman, when I interviewed him, he talked about, and this is in jazz, but you were a jazz fanatic within these British bands, and he
Yeah.
talked about whether it was Roy Haynes or Tony or Max Roach, Mickey Roker, it didn't matter. All of
Hmm.
them had a defined character on their cymbal beat.
Yeah.
And I wanted you to talk about that. Like that, was that a completely organic thing for you as well? Was that development of the cymbal beat for you? Because
No, no, I don't
yeah,
think so. I mean, that was more on the jazz side, really on the jazz side. Um, uh, and I wasn't playing in that style of jazz. I was listening and I knew what was going on very well and I adored it, but I wasn't playing in that style of jazz.
that's right. Yeah, you were
I think,
that's exactly right. Yeah.
I think what I'm thinking was by about the age of 20 and fairly early on, I knew what I wanted to do. And I think what I wanted to do was make a difference. All I wanted to do really was say, well, I see that this guy plays the drums this way and it's really great, but how about if we looked at it this way? Or could I do it a different way to him? It's always difference. That's my creative side to me coming out is how can I make this different from the other guy? And in fact, all the progressive rock groups I grew up with, so King Crimson and Genesis for a year, and Yes, and UK, which was another band. People tend to lump all these bands together as being the same thing. But having played in those four, I can assure you that they're actually quite different about the way they go about making music. Except that it was a blank open sheet. Anybody could play anything at any time that they wanted to. But it was, the band's method of making music was quite different from each other. So no, I
Oh,
wasn't really tied to cymbal playing. It was, in general, what can we do with percussion here? You know.
out of all those bands, I mean, it would be a deep dive to go into each of those specific how
Mm.
music was created. But one of the things that I love about um, certain rock groups, just guys that I've been able to get to know really well, like Michael Shreve and Greg Arico and David Garibaldi. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
these guys who were doing, their own thing, sort of,
Hmm.
juxtaposed to what you were doing. They did this thing that sort of has become a lost art because of just the sonic nature of PA systems and people's need to get louder and louder and louder. Is that they were feathering the bass drum out of all the out of Yes and King Crimson, Genesis. Were you able to get through that sort of which of those bands were you able to most sort of use the aesthetics of feathering the bass drum?
Oh, almost nobody knew what that meant.
No,
Nobody knew
maybe
what.
that's the wrong word, but it was like
No,
you.
it's
Yeah, yeah.
it's a good word, but pretty soon, um, let me think now. Yeah, the bass drum wasn't nearly so loud, of course,
It
which I
wasn't
think
even
is
loud in the recordings. You could barely in the jazz recordings. You barely hear the bass drum.
absolutely in a jazz recording, you hardly heard it at all,
Mhm.
and that's a very pleasurable place to be from the drummer's point of view, telling you the truth, because if you have, as I have had, a bass drum that goes off like a 24 carat howitzer in a 20,000 seat room in, say, Madison Square Garden or something. If you play that drum in the wrong place at any time, or in a different place, or marred 5 milliseconds later or 5 milliseconds earlier, it has a fight. I mean, it's terrible. The volume that you're at, it's sort of overbearing kind of rock volume that can be had. So I prefer, and I work now in much smaller places, much smaller groups with scarcely a microphone on the drums. So that to me is much more fun in my time of life and experience. I prefer to do that. So no, feathering the bass drum, which is for those who don't know, is a kind of continual playing of the bass drum, but very quietly, keeping the pulse going. It's an older jazz drummer's technique, which got abandoned pretty fast when we came around to progressive rock.
Absolutely. It's funny because a guy I work for, we has a local record store here in Tucson. He saw you in Yes at the Tucson Community Center
Oh yeah,
in the early '70s, and I would assume that your first international tour was after you finally had some commercial success with that third record. Is that right?
yeah, that would be about right. I mean, some might have said it was the third records tour. Yeah, they're called the Yes album. Uh,
Right.
I can't
But
really remember.
you were opening for Black Sabbath, and
Yeah, yeah,
everybody was there for Sabbath. And my buddy Bob Lambert said you absolutely blew everybody out of the room. Nobody knew who you were, and then
that's true.
it was just you got. And you know what I wanted to get at was this idea of early on. I remember Harold Jones, great drummer for Basie, and Tony
Mm,
Bennett too, as well.
mhm.
Um, he talked about in Chicago, he playing at one of these clubs on the South Side, and he was with an organ player and a guitar player, and they were both amplified, and he was not. And so, and because the PA systems were relatively antiquated at that time, he had to generate sonically through physicality and soul. And I'm not
Yeah,
being naive here, but I also recognize that, those early Yes years, or also, frankly, some of the Crimson stuff. I mean, technology had not advanced to the point where you were playing with state of the art sound. And I just wanted you to talk about a time, if you could recall a time where, you couldn't necessarily generate sonically because of amplification, and you had to do it through soul and through physicality. Because I just remember people talking
sure.
about Milt Jackson. Milt Jackson had the saddest looking vibes, they said, and yet he would get up there, and when the minute he would hit the vibes, he would breathe out. And what I'm saying is, I see a lot of cats today either really obsessed with making sure they can hear themselves, which means you're
Hmm.
obviously going to be behind the beat, or they're just
Hmm.
sort of into the technology of it all. When all the seminal stuff that so many of your compadres and you guys did came with a lot of war, you did not have pristine technology. And I kind of just wanted you to talk about, without overplaying, like you talked about, without smashing things, how you generated sonically
Well,
without.
yeah,
Yeah.
you've got a big question there. I think probably a quick story, a quick run through how it all worked from my point of view is we barely we started. I started my drumming in London with barely without a PA at all. There would be a PA microphone for the singer, so you go and hear Mick Jagger with the Rolling Stones. You couldn't hear a word the guy was singing about. It was crap, because
Yeah, I get it.
the
Yeah.
guitars were too loud. And from that day on, I've not been that interested in the lyrics. Why? Because I couldn't ever hear them. They were completely terrible. And then the amplifiers, and particularly guy Chris Squire, the bass player, we get huge amplifiers. And at this point, the drums are unmiked. So they were pretty loud, and I'm not a very loud player. I came from the jazz side. I definitely don't smash anything. And just as a side note, Jake, you might be interested to hear I've never broken a drumstick
It's
uh,
amazing
while,
because
while playing.
what's that's so amazing. Well, it's not amazing. It's just your touch is
It's a
really
touch.
insane.
It is a touch, and it's a way that the wrist gives way to the force of the blow and so forth, so you don't break anything. Anyway, that's an aside. I had to learn to project a sound, to find a sound that would cut through the very clanky high frequencies coming from the bass player. So that meant a rim shot. It pretty much meant a rim shot of on every backbeat or every loud note was a rim shot. And I could tune the drum in such a way that it would cut through. And so I became known as a guy with a kind of ringing snare drum. That sort of was not like that dull, deader thud of the late 70s and the early 80s of, say, a Steve Gadd studio date, kind of
Absolutely, yeah.
LA studio sound. So the complete opposite end of that, because I was fighting to be heard. However, I still have my hearing because I was behind the amplifiers, funnily enough. My ear line was behind the amplifiers. what you say about amplification and monitoring is very true. And yes, we're in poor shape until we played a tour with a great American band called Iron Butterfly. But
I love it. Yeah, go ahead.
the thing about Iron Butterfly is that they had their own PA system. We had no idea that you could, first of all, you could have a PA system, and secondly, that it was full of something called monitors, which were big speakers on the floor. So you could hear anybody you liked at any time. And that was great. You heard yourself play beautifully. And we loved that. We played with their system. And then at the end of the tour, we bought their system and owned it. And then carried on with it throughout England. But here's the thing: about the first time, we were able to hear what the organist was doing, one Tony K, and, and it wasn't to everybody's liking suddenly,
Right, right. It's kind of maybe it's a drawback to a degree, you know?
Absolutely, it's a bit of a drawback, and pretty soon, the heads started to roll. Maybe we should have a different keyboard player, and then maybe we need a different guitar player, because everybody could suddenly hear everybody, which is quite a side issue there. And eventually, of course, it all got better, and I didn't have to play quite so hard or force anything so much. And nowadays, the instruments are brighter too. These days, the drums are much better. They project much better. The drum heads are much better. Everything is better now. It's a much more sophisticated, of course, audio environment or acoustic environment in which we drummers have to play. So things have got nothing but better, really.
I wonder about this, and you can take it into the present era, but I think I know your answer, but one thing that drives me a little bit insane, I mean, it's easy for me to say as a as a critic or whatever, as a fanatic,
Uh-huh.
but has Bill Bruford ever ascribed to in-ear monitors? To me, there's nothing worse. To me, part of that Iron Butterfly, I remember Tootie Heath told me that, and believe it or not, acoustic Herbie Hancock before the Headhunters opened for Iron Butterfly. They shared a bill together, and
Oh yeah.
yeah, and it was just the idea here is that whether it was feedback or the environmental noise is something that's part of the musical conversation. And the minute that you put in-ear monitors in, you're really just more focused on your hearing yourself or hearing the band. And I just early on, like when you were on those seminal tours early on, I just wonder about um, you know, the idea of have you ever ascribed to wearing in-ear
Oh,
monitors?
I understand I understand what you're talking about, and I think it's a really interesting question, which unfortunately I can't answer because I've never tried in-ear
Good.
monitoring.
No, see, I knew this because the
I've,
environment. Can you talk about the environmental piece of the sound of the actual live event?
the environmental piece. Well, yes, but let's just back up again
Sure.
a little bit just to say that I don't monitor my drums. I listen to the drum sound as I'm playing it. And if I can't hear myself, then either I've got to get bigger drum set, or the other guys in the band are playing way too loud.
I love
And
this. Yeah.
and there was a great time in King Crimson in the middle 90s, 1995, 6, somewhere around there, where we had a lovely studio, great pocket drummer from LA called Pat Mastelotto. And he was a very good drummer, but his idea of dynamics were flat.
Right.
He didn't come from any kind of a music which had anything other than completely compressed dynamics. And he was in a big band called Mr. Mister, and the cabinets monitoring his drums were so loud, I just seriously worried about his hearing. Added to which I couldn't hear myself play, and he was about 10, 15 meters away across a huge stage. So isn't that amazing? So there was
That no,
I.
that is not. I've heard that before. That I bet he did blow out his ears.
He might have done,
Yeah.
but it was just the difference in cultures is very interesting. The LA studio drummer versus the little pinky white British neo jazz guy, who's never managed to find a good monitor system, let alone in-ear monitors, playing at what we would say is kind of conversational level. And Pat a beautiful drummer in his own style, terrific. Just so loud. It was really really frightening. I'm not
Can
sure
you?
how we got onto that topic, but
No,
no,
go
I
ahead.
don't know anything
I'm
about.
I'm just curious
You
about
should.
like the audience, the playing the I guess I don't know if environment's the right word, but it's not like this. I just know a lot of cats get spooked because when they can't hear themselves, sometimes um, they forget that all they need to do is just listen to what's going on around them, and part of
Absolutely,
that is the
absolutely.
environment. I mean,
Yeah,
I'd love you to
indeed.
talk about that. How you became what would be your advice to younger cats to become more comfortable going out on the limb, knowing that they might fall apart, but it's okay to get back on the tracks and keep
Uh,
burning?
the, the best thing is have no monitor system at all. Absolutely, the best
Exactly.
thing. The best thing is to play at an agreeable dynamic level such that all members of the band can hear each other while in action. And if somebody is spoiling that and playing too loud, he's got to play quieter. It's perfectly possible to play quieter, you know. It can be done. I've heard musicians do it. um, so that's where you would start. You need an internal balance. And in fact, I was just rehearsing today with two guys, and I'm in a band over here is doing a trio. Very easy, very professional guys, and they play at a volume that's pretty ballsy. I mean, it's got a lot of guts to it, but it's balanced. Each combo needs its own internal balance. Whether you're the John Coltrane Quartet, I mean, Coltrane played pretty loud, and McCoy Tyner had to, and Elvin. And McCoy Tyner had to find a style of block chord piano playing that would kind of hold up in that environment.
I completely agree.
So
I mean, there's more like the padding, underneath to support it
yeah,
all with him
yeah,
and Elvin.
yeah, yeah.
I,
Somebody,
I,
somebody,
I
somebody once likened, I think it was a great line. I'm trying to remember it. Playing with Elvin, like trying to light a cigarette in a hurricane. Quite a
did you
nice
ever?
line.
I mean, it's funny. When I interviewed Ayerto, when he first came to the States, he would go see Elvin at the Village Gate, and Elvin, uh, kind of from a distance would be very intimidating looking, and then the minute you
Yeah,
walk up to him, he'd start smiling with those big white teeth, and then
yeah, yeah,
Ayerto.
yeah.
Did you have a chance to cross paths with Elvin at any
Oh
point?
no, not at all. I wouldn't have dared say anything. And the only time I got near Tony Williams
Hmm.
was after a really bad gig here in England where he had a kind of pickup trio, which wasn't much good. And I just wanted to give him my well, my appreciation, as it were, of
Sure,
his
sure.
work in the dressing room. And I just got a short and a bad vibe, so I left pretty quick. So yeah, I
You
wasn't
know,
going to bother Tony any more than he needed bothering.
I wanted to, because we're vastly approaching the end of step one here quickly. I wanted to ask you about, I'm always fascinated with the idea of um, the first time Brother Bruford was in the studio. Was it a jingle? Was it a Suds and Duds commercial? Do you remember what was your first studio date?
Yeah, yeah, good, very good question. It was the first Yes record.
Really?
Yeah, it's the first album, and I
Wow.
didn't realize that you could put on headphones and hear the other musicians a bit. I didn't realize that you could have different amounts of each instrument in each headphone. So I played with some terrible guitar reverb coming up in one side of my ears, and a very loud keyboard player in the other side of the ears, and very little of my own drums. And I didn't realize you could say to the producer, "Hey," or the technical guy, "Hey, could we have that different?" So that shows you how green we were. I would have been about 18, maybe. I'd never been in a studio before, and frightening it was. But it's a quick learn. It's a quick learn. So
But I
my
want to be clear. I mean, at that time, no drum booths, right? It was just baffles.
um, yeah, I think that's right. They're just baffles. That's right.
Because like
No,
what I love about those early recordings, again, it's antithetical to what people think is commercial, but it's like there's something called good leakage. It's called room sound. It's called
oh, room sound.
spirit
Absolutely.
running
Room
through the room.
ambience.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely. It's the glue that glues the various instruments together and into an audio space. And I love that. It's great.
Let me ask you, do you think that we could do set two? maybe next in a couple weeks, something like that. It's just we're 45 minutes in, and I just wanted to get to some more stuff with you later.
Yeah, yeah, sure. In a couple of weeks, sure, we could do that. Yeah,
I'll send you some dates, and we'll hit again. We'll do another quick set, 45.
that Jake, that'd be fine. Sorry to cut this seemingly a bit short, but I didn't realize quite how long we were going to go for,
Dude, this
and I
was
have.
a this was a hot first set, and we'll pick it up again, man. But it was so the way you articulate this stuff is very profound, and I'm very humbled by it, man. So thank you so much.
Okay, we'll
Yeah,
do it. We'll do it again. Send me an email, and we'll find a date.
thank you, sir.
All right, Jake. Good to speak to you. Bye.
Bye later.